The Hellfire Club, Satanic cult of Britain's elite, or history's most dangerous joke. Imagine a society that existed only in the shadows, a club whose members were the most powerful men in the British Empire. Statesmen, poets, artists, and aristocrats. By day, they governed a nation, debated in the House of Lords, and shaped the course of history. But by night, it was whispered. They engaged in other, darker pursuits. In the ruins of a desecrated abbey and in the cold, damp heart of man-made caves, they were said to conduct mock rituals, hold blasphemous orgies, and toast the devil himself. They were known by many names: the Knights of St. Francis. The monks of Medmenham, but history remembers them by their most infamous title, the Hellfire Club. For centuries, their name has been a byword for aristocratic depravity and satanic conspiracy. But what was the truth behind the rumors? Was this a genuine cult of devil worshippers? An elaborate, theatrical joke? Or was it something far more dangerous? A secret network of the elite, whose scandalous downfall would shake the very foundations of the British government. This is a story of sin and secrecy in 18th century Britain. A story that reminds us that sometimes the greatest darkness is found in the highest places. To understand the darkness, we must first understand the light it pushes against. To find the origins of a club named for hell, we must begin in an age that believed it was building a heaven on earth. We must travel back to the Britain of the mid-18th century, the Georgian era, a time that saw itself as the triumphant peak of civilization. This was the age of reason. For the intellectual classes of Britain, the world had finally begun to make sense. The universe was no longer a place of inscrutable divine whim, of terrifying portents and demonic influence. It was, as the great Sir Isaac Newton had demonstrated, a magnificent and rational machine, a cosmic clockwork governed by universal, predictable laws of physics and gravity. God, for many, had ceased to be an interventionist king and had become a divine watchmaker, the great architect who had set the universe in motion and then stepped back to admire his perfect, logical creation. This new confidence in reason and order was reflected everywhere. In philosophy, thinkers like John Locke championed empiricism and the rights of man. In politics, the chaos of the previous century's civil wars had given way to a stable constitutional monarchy and a powerful parliament. Britain was growing rich, its commercial empire expanding across the globe, its navy ruling the waves. There was a palpable sense of optimism, a belief that through reason, science, and commerce, humanity could achieve a state of perpetual progress. This philosophy was quite literally built into the landscape. The chaotic, organic tangle of the medieval city was being replaced by the elegant symmetry of the Georgian square. The dark, brooding aesthetic of the Gothic was supplanted by the clean, harmonious lines of Palladian architecture, a style that self-consciously imitated the perceived virtue and reason of the Roman Republic. Society, at least on its polished surface, was remaking itself in the image of this new, rational ideal. The watchword of this new society was politeness. The ideal gentleman was no longer the swashbuckling cavalier of the past, but a man of taste, refinement, and decorum. Conversation in the newly fashionable coffee houses was to be witty but not coarse. Public virtue was to be cultivated. Emotion was to be controlled, passions tempered by reason. It was an age that valued the carefully constructed public persona, the performance of respectability. But a cage, even one gilded with reason and politeness, is still a cage. And beneath this gleaming surface of civilization, a very different energy was stirring. For the aristocratic elite, the very class that benefited most from this new age of stability and wealth, the world of decorum could also be profoundly suffocating. For a generation of young noblemen born into almost unimaginable privilege, life was a performance with a very dull script. They inherited vast estates and fortunes without ever needing to work. They were granted seats in the House of Lords by right of birth. They were cushioned from the harsh realities of the world by a mountain of inherited wealth. And with this immense freedom came an immense boredom, a deep, restless appetite for something more than polite conversation and predictable minuets, an appetite for risk, for rebellion, for chaos, an appetite for unreason. The escape valve for this pent-up energy, the official, socially sanctioned rite of passage for this entire class of men, was a ritual known as the Grand Tour. On the surface, the Grand Tour was the finishing school for an English gentleman. A young man, having completed his studies at Oxford or Cambridge, would embark on a journey across the continent, typically lasting for months, often for years. Accompanied by a tutor, known as a bear leader, he would travel through France and, most importantly, Italy. The stated purpose was educational. He was to immerse himself in the art, history, and politics of Europe. He was to learn languages, study the architecture of Palladio in Vicenza, admire the Renaissance masterpieces in Florence, and, as the climax of his journey, walk among the noble ruins of ancient Rome. He was meant to return to England as a man of the world, a dilettante, a man of taste and classical refinement, ready to take his place as a patron of the arts and a leader of his nation. And many did. But the Grand Tour had a shadow curriculum, a secret syllabus of sin and liberation. For the first time, these young men were freed from the watchful eyes of their families and the restrictive social codes of England. Paris offered an education in courtly intrigue and sophisticated dalliance. Venice, with its famous courtesans and the anarchic freedom of its carnival season, offered an immersion in sensual pleasure and masquerade. The cities of the continent became a playground where they could indulge in the passions that were so carefully repressed at home. They gambled away small fortunes, drank to excess, and engaged in extravagant sexual adventures. It was a pressure valve, a period of sanctioned wildness before they were expected to settle down, marry, and produce an heir. But the most profound transformation occurred in Italy. As these young Englishmen wandered through the ruins of the Roman Empire, they were confronted with a vision of the past that was profoundly at odds with the Christian morality of their homeland. They were, of course, expected to admire the works of the High Renaissance and the grandeur of St. Peter's Basilica. But many were drawn to something older, something more primal, that lay just beneath the surface. They were fascinated by the pagan world. Not the civic, republican Rome of Cicero and Cato that was praised in Parliament, but the other Rome. The Rome of the mystery cults, of ecstatic ritual, of a frank and unapologetic celebration of the body and its desires. In the newly unearthed ruins of Herculaneum and Pompeii, they saw villas decorated with explicit, erotic frescoes. In the museums, they saw statues of Pan, the goat god of nature and panic, of Priapus with his exaggerated phallus, of Venus rising naked from the sea. They read the works of classical authors like Ovid and Petronius, who described a world of sensual indulgence and magical transformation. This was a world without sin, a world where the gods themselves were driven by lust, jealousy, and a thirst for wine. It was a powerful, seductive alternative to the gray, repressive world of English Protestantism. They were discovering a religion of beauty, pleasure, and freedom. They returned to England changed men. They brought back not just classical statues and Renaissance paintings to decorate their country estates, but a new sensibility. They were men of reason who had been given a taste of ecstatic abandon. They were Christian gentlemen who had developed a deep nostalgia for a pagan paradise. They were public figures who now craved a secret space to explore the libertine ideas they had absorbed abroad. This fundamental contradiction, the public performance of Georgian reason and the private appetite for pagan unreasonis, the key to understanding the Hellfire Club. It was not a product of madness or evil. It was the logical, theatrical creation of a generation of powerful men who felt trapped between two worlds. And no one embodied this contradiction more flamboyantly, or pursued its implications with more theatrical zeal, than the club's founder, guiding spirit, and high priest of pleasure, Sir Francis Dashwood. Every secret society, every movement, every great work of art or act of rebellion begins with a single driving personality. For the infamous fraternity that history would call the Hellfire Club, that personality belonged to one man. He was its founder, its abbot, its guiding spirit, and its chief provocateur. If the club was a grand, blasphemous piece of theater, he was its playwright and lead actor. His name was Sir Francis Dashwood, 11th Baron Lou Despencer. To understand the Hellfire Club, one must first understand Dashwood, for the club was nothing less than a projection of his own character. His charm, his intelligence, his wealth, his obsessions, and his profound, theatrical appetite for life. He was, in many ways, the perfect product of his class. Born in 1708, he inherited his family's title and a vast fortune at the tender age of 15. This single event defined his existence. He was granted a lifetime of near absolute freedom and financial independence, with no need to ever work or answer to anyone. It was a recipe for either greatness or spectacular dissipation, and Dashwood would enthusiastically pursue both. He was possessed of a restless, insatiable energy. He was well-educated, charismatic, and by all accounts, incredibly handsome. But beneath the polished exterior of the English aristocrat was a born showman, a man who saw the world as a stage for his own amusement and who delighted in shocking the sensibilities of the stuffy and the pious. And the stage upon which he would first rehearse his life's performance was the Grand Tour. Dashwood did not simply take the Grand Tour, he consumed it. His journeys across the continent were not the quiet, scholarly sojourns of a budding connoisseur. They were a series of audacious, almost legendary, adventures that established his reputation as England's most incorrigible rake. His travels took him further afield than most. In Russia, he embarked on a diplomatic and romantic escapade of breathtaking arrogance. Disguised as Charles XII, the long-dead heroic king of Sweden, he reportedly attempted to insert himself into the court and the bed off the reigning Tsarina, and the stunt was a failure. but it was a perfect example of the Dashwood style. Theatrical, risky, and driven by a blend of intellectual curiosity and pure lust. In the Papal States in Italy, his antics became even more provocative, aimed squarely at the institution he would despise for the rest of his life, the Roman Catholic Church. In one notorious incident during Holy Week in Rome, he stumbled upon a procession of flagellants devout penitents who would whip themselves in the streets as an act of piety. Finding the spectacle both ridiculous and offensive, Dashwood, it is said, grabbed a large horsewhip and, with a great cry, joined the procession, lashing the bare backs of the penitents with such vigor that the procession scattered in chaos and terror. It was a calculated act of sacrilege, a direct, physical assault on what he saw as grotesque religious superstition. He was a man collecting experiences, not just art, but he was also collecting like-minded friends. In Italy, he became a leading member of the Society of Dilettanti. The name, which simply means lovers of the arts, was a clever front. Publicly, it was a club for English gentlemen who had been on the grand tour to promote the study of classical art and architecture. Privately, its meetings were defined by heavy drinking, bawdy songs, and a general atmosphere of libertine camaraderie. The Society's motto gives a sense of its priorities, seria ludo, or serious things in a playful way. It was a perfect encapsulation of the spirit Dashwood would bring to his own future clubs. But what truly shaped Dashwood's worldview in Italy was not the high-minded art of the Renaissance, but the pagan world that lay buried beneath it. He was not interested in the Christian Rome of the popes and saints. He was captivated by the sensual, magical, and morally ambiguous Rome of the Caesars and the mystery cults. He became a devoted student of ancient pagan religions. He eagerly sought out and collected classical erotica. He commissioned paintings of himself not as a sober English lord, but as a tonsured Franciscan friar, gazing in lustful adoration at a statue of the nude Venus. In another, he is depicted as Saint Francis, kneeling before the Madonna, but the Madonna's face is that of a famous London courtesan. This is the crucial key to understanding Dashwood's philosophy and the nature of the Hellfire Club. He was not a Satanist. He had no interest in the Christian devil. His rebellion was not an inversion of Christianity, but a rejection of it. He was a neo-pagan. He saw the Christian tradition, with its emphasis on original sin, mortification of the flesh, and the promise of a deferred, otherworldly salvation, as a life-denying force. It was a religion of gloom, superstition, and repression. In the classical world, he saw the opposite, a celebration of life in the here and now, a world where gods were driven by recognizably human passions, where wine and love were sacred, where the body was not a source of sin but a vessel for pleasure. He wanted to resurrect the spirit, to live by a classical pagan ethos in the heart of 18th-century Christian England. When Sir Francis returned to England, he dutifully took up the responsibilities of his class. He became a member of Parliament, where he was a competent if not brilliant politician, known for his wit and his opposition to government corruption. He would eventually rise, through political friendships, to the high office of Chancellor of the Exchequer, a post for which he was so famously inept that his tenure lasted less than a year. His public life was respectable, but his true passion, his life's great work, was conducted in private. It was the creation of a series of exclusive clubs and societies where he and his circle of friends could bring their continental fantasies to life. He poured his vast fortune into his family estate, West Wickham Park, transforming it into a masterpiece of landscape gardening. But his was not a typical English garden. It was a philosophical and sensual playground. He dotted the landscape with temples dedicated to classical deities, a temple of music, a temple of Apollo, and, most tellingly, a temple of Venus, built over a cave that was likely used for erotic dalliances. Dashwood was creating a private world, a personal kingdom dedicated to the principles of beauty, liberty, and pleasure. But he needed a court. He needed a brotherhood of like-minded men to inhabit this world with him. He had already founded a number of dining clubs and drinking societies, each more outrageous than the last. But he was preparing for his masterwork. He was about to create a society that would synthesize all his passions for theater, for classical antiquity, for blasphemy, and for secrecy into a single legendary institution. He had found the perfect location, a romantic, ruined abbey on the banks of the River Thames. His great performance was about to begin. Every secret society needs a sacred space, a temple, a lodge room set apart from the mundane world where its mysteries can unfold. For Sir Francis Dashwood and his circle, the stage for their great theatrical rebellion would be a place already steeped in history and forgotten piety. In 1751, he leased a property that was perfect for his purposes. Medmenham Abbey, the picturesque, crumbling ruin of a 12th-century Cistercian monastery, nestled on the banks of the Thames in Buckinghamshire. A Cistercian abbey was a place of silence, of austerity, of solemn devotion to God. It was, in other words, the perfect symbolic target for Dashwood's brand of libertine paganism. He would take this house of Christian prayer and transform it into a palace of earthly pleasure. He would not just occupy the ruins. He would resurrect them into a new and blasphemous form. Dashwood, with his immense wealth and theatrical flair, set about restoring the abbey. But this was no mere historical preservation. It was a complete reimagining. He rebuilt the structure in the newly fashionable Gothic Revival style, a mode of architecture that deliberately evoked a sense of medieval mystery and romantic gloom. This was not about authenticity. It was about creating an atmosphere. The details were meticulously designed to both honor and mock the abbey's original purpose. He commissioned stained glass windows, but instead of depicting saints and biblical scenes, they were filled with pornographic imagery and satirical portraits of the club's members in compromising positions. The library was filled not with theological tomes, but with classical erotica and works of philosophy. The abbey's grounds were transformed into an erotic paradise, a landscape designed to stimulate the senses and celebrate a pagan worldview. Classical statues of Venus, the goddess of love, and Bacchus, the god of wine, were placed in prominent positions. A statue of the harp-playing god Harpocrates, finger held to his lips, stood at the entrance, a potent symbol of the silence and secrecy demanded of all who entered. Dashwood was creating an immersive, multi-sensory experience. It was a meticulously crafted fantasy world, a sacred playground where England's most powerful men could shed their public personas and step into a different reality. He gave his new fraternity a name that was itself a perfect parody of a Christian order, the Knights of St. Francis of Wickham, a nod to his own name and estate. The members, limited to a core of 12 apostles, referred to themselves simply as the monks of Medmenham. But the club's true philosophy, its single guiding principle, was made clear to all who passed through the abbey's doors. Carved in stone into the archway above the main entrance was a phrase. It was not a quotation from the Bible or a sober classical motto. It was a line taken from the great 16th-century French humanist and satirist, François Rabelais, from his description of the utopian Abbey of Theleme in the book Gargantua and Pantagruel. The inscription read, "Fais ce que voudras. Do what thou wilt. Do what thou wilt." This was not just a motto. It was the club's sole commandment. It was a radical declaration of absolute personal freedom, a defiant rejection of all external moral authority, whether from the church, the state, or polite society. Within the walls of Medmenham Abbey, the only law was the individual's own will. It's a phrase with a long and potent legacy. It is the very essence of libertinism. And more than a century later, it would be adopted by the infamous magician Aleister Crowley as the central, sacred law of his new religion, Thelema name itself taken directly from Rabelais' fictional abbey. The line of influence, from a 16th-century French satire, to an 18th-century aristocratic pleasure club, to the cornerstone of 20th-century occultism, is direct and undeniable. So what did the monks do under this commandment of absolute freedom? What actually happened within the walls of this Abbey of Thelema? The rumors that swirled in London society, fueled by whispers and the horrified imaginations of the public, painted a lurid picture of devil worship, of black masses, of virgins sacrificed on profane altars. The reality, as pieced together from the few surviving accounts, was likely something both less diabolical and, in its own way, more psychologically interesting. The club was, at its core, an exclusive and extravagantly expensive dining and drinking society. The members, dressed in the white robes of Franciscan monks, would gather for sumptuous feasts. The food was exquisite, and the wine flowed endlessly. They referred to their fine claret and burgundy as holy water and river of Jordan, and drank toasts to pagan gods and obscene saints from chalices and, reputedly, from polished human skulls. They were attended, we are told, by nuns. These were not kidnapped virgins, but high-class prostitutes from London, dressed for the occasion in the habits of a religious order. They served the wine, provided the entertainment, and participated in the sexual revels that were the centerpiece of the club's activities. Medmenham was, in essence, a high-concept, themed brothel for the ruling class. The rituals performed were not satanic, but they were deeply blasphemous. They were elaborate theatrical parodies of Roman Catholic rites, the specific target of Dashwood's anti-clericalism. Instead of a mass for Jesus Christ, they may have held a mass for the pagan god Bacchus. Instead of praying to the Virgin Mary, they would conduct ceremonies in honor of Venus. They sang bawdy, satirical hymns, replacing pious lyrics with obscene ones. This was rebellion through mockery. It was the sophisticated, ironic blasphemy of educated men who knew the liturgy of the church well enough to subvert it with precision. They were not worshipping evil. They were laughing at what they considered to be a hollow and repressive good. They were using the forms of religion to celebrate the pleasures of the flesh. The Hellfire Club at Medmenham was a grand, theatrical joke. It was a carefully staged production, a piece of immersive theater where the members were the actors and the audience. But it was a joke that carried an immense risk. The line between ironic, satirical blasphemy and genuine, damnable heresy is a thin one. And for the pious, unironic public outside the abbey's walls, it was a line that did not exist at all. If the secrets of Medmenham were ever to be revealed, the joke would be mistaken for a terrifying conspiracy, and the laughter would turn to outrage. The survival of the club, and the reputations of the powerful men within it, depended entirely on a sacred, unbreakable bond of secrecy. A secret is only as powerful as the people who keep it. A scandal is only as dangerous as the reputations it threatens to destroy. The Hellfire Club, with its blasphemous rituals and libertine philosophy, was playing a dangerous game. But what elevated this game from a private folly to a matter of national significance was the identity of the players. This was not a club of marginalized bohemians or disaffected outsiders. Its members were not rebels plotting from the fringes of society. They were the absolute center of it. The monks who gathered at Medmenham Abbey were, by day, the statesmen, aristocrats, and artists who governed the British Empire. This was the dark playground of the establishment. And this is what made their bond of secrecy not just a matter of social decorum, but a pact of mutual preservation, underpinned by the implicit threat of shared ruin. The core membership was deliberately exclusive, limited to 12 apostles in imitation of Christ's disciples, with Sir Francis Dashwood presiding as the benevolent, if blasphemous, abbot. While a complete, verified list has never been found, secrecy was, after all, their creed. The names that have survived are a roll call of the 18th century elite. There was Bub Dodington, a fabulously wealthy and notoriously corpulent politician, known for his ostentatious vanity and his intricate political maneuvering. There was Francis Hastings, the 10th Earl of Huntingdon, a courtier and military officer. And perhaps most astonishingly, there was John Stuart, the 3rd Earl of Bute. Bute was not just a powerful nobleman. He was the former tutor and closest advisor to the young King George III, and in 1762, he would become the Prime Minister of Great Britain. The idea that the king's most trusted minister, the head of his government, was a member of this secret, debauched fraternity is a staggering thought. It speaks to the immense power and privilege of this network. The arts were represented as well. The club's official steward of the household was Paul Whitehead, a minor poet and a well-known satirist of the age. Whitehead was Dashwood's loyal lieutenant, the man who helped manage the abbey's affairs and likely composed much of the bawdy, anti-clerical verse that was recited during their gatherings. Other artists and intellectuals, like the painter William Hogarth, were certainly part of Dashwood's wider social circle and likely visitors to the abbey, even if they were not formal members of the inner circle. But among this brethren of the powerful and privileged, two members stand out, two figures whose tempestuous friendship and eventual, spectacular betrayal would define the club's public legacy and trigger its ultimate downfall. The first was John Montagu, the 4th Earl of Sandwich. Today, his name is most commonly associated with the food he supposedly invented, but in his own time, he was a figure of immense political power and notorious personal corruption. He served multiple times as First Lord of the Admiralty, the head of the powerful Royal Navy, a position of immense strategic importance to the burgeoning British Empire. In his private life, however, Lord Sandwich was a legendary libertine. He was an insatiable gambler, so devoted to the card table that he would refuse to leave even for meals. It was this habit that led to his culinary innovation, ordering his servants to bring him slices of beef clamped between two pieces of bread, allowing him to eat with one hand while continuing his game with the other. He was known for his wit, his charm, and a complete and utter lack of moral scruples. A contemporary once remarked of him that he was seldom known to be sober and never known to be solvent. In the Hellfire Club, Lord Sandwich found a perfect outlet for his appetites, a space where his public dignity could be gleefully cast aside. He was a man who understood the value of a useful secret. The second key figure, and the Earl of Sandwich's eventual nemesis, was John Wilkes. Wilkes was, in almost every way, a force of nature. He was famously and cartoonishly ugly, a fact he cheerfully acknowledged and used to his advantage. When a constituent once told him that he would rather vote for the devil, Wilkes is said to have replied, "Naturally. But if your friend is not standing, may I count on your support?" What he lacked in conventional beauty, he more than made up for in charisma, intelligence, and a razor-sharp wit. He was a radical journalist and a member of Parliament who positioned himself as the great champion of English liberty against the perceived tyranny of the king and his ministers. His newspaper, the North Briton, was a constant source of outrage for the government, as it fearlessly criticized their policies and exposed their corruption. For the common people of London, Wilkes was a hero. For the establishment, he was a dangerous demagogue. In the Hellfire Club, Wilkes found a brotherhood of fellow iconoclasts. He and Dashwood were kindred spirits, bonded by a shared love of classical literature, a hatred of hypocrisy, and a delight in witty blasphemy. He was a central and enthusiastic participant in the revels at Medmenham, his sharp tongue and rebellious spirit perfectly suited to the club's atmosphere. This, then, was the Brethren, a volatile mix of prime ministers, poets, gamblers, and radicals. What bound them together? It was more than just shared interests. It was a bond forged in shared transgression. The secrecy of the Hellfire Club was its most sacred principle because it was a form of mutual assurance. Every member who participated in the mock rituals, who drank from the profane chalices, who dallied with the nuns, was complicit. Every man held the secrets of the others. Their public careers, their family names, their very positions in society were predicated on the absolute silence of their brothers in sin. To expose one would be to risk exposing them all. It was a conspiracy of pleasure, a pact of silence held together by the unspoken threat of blackmail. As long as the bond held, they were untouchable. They could rule the country by day and play at being pagans by night, secure in the knowledge that their two worlds would never collide. But this gentleman's agreement, this bond between sinners, was built on a foundation of profound cynicism. It assumed that every member's self-interest would forever align with the group's. It did not account for the corrosive power of political ambition, or the moment when the rewards of betrayal might outweigh the comforts of fellowship. The chain was only as strong as its weakest, most ambitious link. And that link was about to break. A club as dedicated to theater and secrecy as the Hellfire Club could not be confined to a single stage. As the years passed, and perhaps as the novelty of Medmenham Abbey began to fade, Sir Francis Dashwood's focus shifted back to the heart of his own personal kingdom. His ancestral estate, West Wickham Park. The Abbey, with its riverside location, was relatively public. For the club's deeper and more private mysteries, Dashwood would create a new temple, one hidden not in plain sight, but deep within the earth itself. He would excavate a modern catacomb, a man-made underworld that would become the club's second, more enigmatic, and far more infamous lair, the Hellfire Caves. The project began around 1748 and continued for several years. The official, public justification for this massive undertaking was a work of civic charity. The local agricultural economy was in a deep depression, and the excavation of the chalk and flint from West Wickham Hill provided steady employment for hundreds of local villagers who would otherwise have starved. The quarried flint was then used to build a new, straight road between West Wickham and High Wickham, a piece of modern infrastructure that benefited the entire community. On the surface, it was a model of enlightened aristocratic benevolence. Sir Francis, the lord of the manor, was providing for his people. But Dashwood was never a man to engage in a project with only one purpose. The charitable road-building scheme was also the perfect cover for his true, esoteric ambition. He was not just quarrying a hill, he was hollowing it out, creating a private subterranean world to his own very specific design. The result was a remarkable feat of engineering and imagination. A network of tunnels and chambers stretching for a quarter of a mile, cut directly into the soft chalk, descending 300 feet beneath the summit of the hill. To enter the caves was to embark on a symbolic journey, a carefully orchestrated descent into a pagan underworld. The main entrance itself was a piece of pure Dashwood theater. It was a grand, Gothic archway, built in the style of a ruined church facade, complete with a crumbling tower. The juxtaposition was deliberate. To enter Dashwood's temple of pleasure, one first had to pass through the decaying husk of a Christian church. Once inside, the visitor would leave the sunlit world behind and move through a series of winding, chalk-walled passages. These tunnels opened into a series of chambers, each with its own name and purpose. There was a space known as the Steward's Chamber, and another called Paul Whitehead's Chamber, named for the club's loyal poet and manager, where he supposedly kept the club's records. Deeper in, the passage led to a small, triangular chamber, its significance still debated by historians. Was it a symbol of the Christian Trinity, or something else entirely? Then came one of the most dramatic features of the descent, an artificial underground stream, which had to be crossed by a small bridge. Dashwood, ever the classicist, called this the River Styx, after the mythical river that, in Greek mythology, formed the boundary between the earth and the underworld, the land of the dead. To cross this river was to leave the world of the living behind and to enter the realm of shades and mysteries. Having crossed the River Styx, the initiate would finally arrive at the sacred heart of the complex, the inner temple. This was a vast, circular cavern, the largest of all the chambers, with a high, vaulted ceiling and several smaller alcoves or cells carved into its walls. This was the club's sanctum sanctorum, the place where its most secret rituals were undoubtedly performed. The location of the inner temple was chosen with breathtaking symbolic audacity. Dashwood had precisely calculated its position. It lay directly, 300 feet vertically, beneath the foundations of the Church of St. Lawrence, which sat on the summit of the hill. Dashwood had also lavishly rebuilt this church, but in his own eccentric style. He decorated its interior like a classical Roman temple and, most famously, topped its tower not with a cross, but with a huge, hollow golden ball, large enough for several men to sit inside with a bottle of wine. The symbolism was unmistakable and profound. The Christian church on the surface, with its mysterious golden sphere reaching for the heavens, was mirrored by the pagan temple deep within the earth. It was a physical manifestation of the Hermetic axiom, as above, so below. And it was a defiant statement that at the heart of his world, hidden beneath the veneer of Anglican respectability, lay a secret, pagan core. What rituals took place in this inner temple? Here, the historical record gives way to speculation. Unlike the raucous, drunken revels at Medmenham, the atmosphere of the caves suggests something more serious, more focused. It is here, if anywhere, that the members would have conducted more formal, esoteric ceremonies, perhaps initiations into the deeper degrees of the club. The journey through the caves itself from light to darkness, across the water, into the final chamber is a classic initiatory pattern, a symbolic death and rebirth. It is in the context of these more serious proceedings that we find one of the Hellfire Club's most surprising and tantalizing connections. During the 1750s and again in the 1770s, one of the most frequent and welcome guests at Sir Francis Dashwood's West Wickham estate was a visitor from the American colonies, Benjamin Franklin. Franklin, at the time, was serving as an agent for Pennsylvania in London. He and Dashwood became firm and fast friends. They were both men of the Enlightenment, fascinated by science, politics, and philosophy. They were both high-ranking Freemasons. They collaborated on projects, including a simplified revision of the Anglican Book of Common Prayer. Franklin spent a great deal of time at West Wickham, referring to Dashwood in his letters with great affection. This raises an unavoidable and fascinating question. Did Benjamin Franklin, a founding father of the United States, the very embodiment of practical reason and civic virtue, descend into the Hellfire Caves and participate in the club's rituals? There is no direct evidence that he was a formal, initiated monk. Given his pragmatic and somewhat puritanical character, it seems unlikely. But given his deep friendship with Dashwood and his own insatiable curiosity, it is almost inconceivable that he would not have been aware of the club's nature, and it is highly probable that his host would have given him a personal tour of his remarkable subterranean creation. The image is a powerful one. The future of American democracy and the secret, decadent heart of the British aristocracy, meeting in a torchlit cavern deep within the earth. It is a potent symbol of the strange, overlapping worlds of the 18th century, where reason and unreason, public virtue and private vice, could exist side by side, often in the very same people. The caves were the club's ultimate secret, a pagan sanctuary hidden from the prying eyes of the world. But secrets, especially those kept by powerful and ambitious men, have a fragile half-life. And the secrets of the Hellfire Club were about to crawl out of the darkness and explode into the light of a public scandal that would shake the nation. The downfall of a secret society rarely comes from without. It is not the crusading priest or the moralizing journalist who poses the greatest threat. The mortal blow almost always comes from within. The Hellfire Club, a fraternity built on a sacred bond of secrecy and shared transgression, was not destroyed by an angry mob or a church inquisition. It was brought down by the cold, calculated ambition of its own members. The pact between sinners was about to be broken in a stunning and very public act of political betrayal. The story of the club's demise is the story of two of its most prominent brethren, two men who had shared wine and blasphemies in the profane abbey, but who now stood on opposite sides of a bitter political war, John Wilkes and the Earl of Sandwich. By the year 1763, John Wilkes had become the most celebrated and most hated man in England. Through his fiercely satirical newspaper, The North Briton, he had launched a relentless assault on the government of the Prime Minister, the Earl of Bute, and on the perceived overreach of royal power by King George III himself. Issue number 45 of The North Briton was the final straw. In it, Wilkes accused the king of lying in a speech to Parliament. This was an unprecedented attack, a direct challenge to the monarch's honor. The government, enraged, decided that Wilkes had to be crushed. They issued a general warrant for his arrest, a legally dubious document that did not name him specifically, and had him thrown into the Tower of London. This act turned Wilkes into a martyr for liberty. The public rallied to his cause. The cry of Wilkes and liberty, and the number 45, became symbols of popular defiance against a tyrannical government. Wilkes skillfully used the courts to challenge the legality of the general warrant and was released, emerging as a hero. The government was humiliated and more determined than ever to find another way to silence him. They needed a different kind of weapon, something that would not just imprison him, but utterly destroy his reputation as a virtuous champion of the people. and they knew exactly where to look. In the secret, shared past of the Hellfire Club. The government's chief attack dog in this affair was a man who knew Wilkes's secrets better than anyone. John Montagu, the 4th Earl of Sandwich. In the new ministry that had replaced Bute's, Sandwich held the powerful position of Secretary of State. He and Wilkes were now sworn political enemies. But it had not always been so. They were brother monks of Medmenham. They had laughed at the same jokes, participated in the same rituals, and were privy to each other's most private indiscretions. Sandwich, a man of immense ambition and few principles, saw an opportunity. Destroying Wilkes would not only serve his political masters, it would eliminate a personal rival. He put the government's machinery to work, searching for a way to prosecute Wilkes on a charge that would stick, something so scandalous it would turn the public against him. Government agents, acting under Sandwich's direction, executed a raid on the private printing press that Wilkes used. They were looking for evidence related to the North Briton, but they found something far more explosive. Tucked away were a few proof pages of a private, unpublished work. It was a poem, an obscene and deeply blasphemous parody of Alexander Pope's famous philosophical work, An Essay on Man. This poem was titled, simply, An Essay on Woman. An Essay on Woman was pure Hellfire Club. It was a piece of satirical filth, a torrent of pornographic verse that systematically mocked both sexual and religious pieties. Its opening lines, a parody of Pope, set the tone. Awake, my Fanny, but its true venom lay in its footnotes. The poem was laid out like a serious academic text, and the notes were attributed to the famously pious and respected Bishop of Gloucester, William Warburton, making it seem as though this great churchman were providing learned commentary on the obscene text. It was a joke of breathtaking audacity, designed to cause maximum offense. The poem was almost certainly a collaborative effort, a piece of private amusement written by several members of the club, likely including Wilkes and the poet Paul Whitehead. Perhaps only a dozen copies were ever printed, intended solely for the entertainment of their secret circle. It was never meant to be seen by the public. It was an inside joke. But now the joke was in the hands of the government, and the Earl of Sandwich knew it was the perfect weapon. On November 15, 1763, the trap was sprung. The setting was the floor of the House of Lords, a place meant to be the moral and political heart of the nation. The government announced it had evidence of a most shocking libel perpetrated by one John Wilkes. The man chosen to present this evidence, to perform the role of the outraged patriot and defender of public morality, was the Earl of Sandwich. What followed was one of the most staggering displays of public hypocrisy in British history. Lord Sandwich, a man whose own nickname was Jemmy Twitcher, after a character in the Beggar's Opera who betrays his friends, a man whose personal debaucheries were legendary throughout London, stood before his fellow peers and feigned a state of profound moral shock. His voice ringing with manufactured horror, he began to read aloud from the pornographic stanzas of An Essay on Woman. He declaimed its lewd passages and thundered against its blasphemous footnotes. The assembled lords, many of them fellow rakes and libertines, dutifully played their part, gasping in performative disgust. The theater of the moment was not lost on everyone. As Sandwich continued his tirade, Lord Despencer Sir Francis Dashwood himself, the abbot of the very club where such works were conceived, is said to have leaned over and dryly whispered the immortal line, "I never expected to hear the devil preaching against sin." The betrayal was total and complete. Sandwich had taken the secrets of their shared private life, the very bond of their fraternity, and weaponized them for public political gain. He had broken the code. He had sacrificed his brother Monk to advance his own career. The government's plan worked perfectly. The combination of sedition and blasphemy was too much. The House of Commons voted to expel Wilkes. He was now facing certain prosecution and imprisonment for both seditious libel for the North Briton and obscene libel for An Essay on Woman. His health failing and his enemies closing in, Wilkes saw only one option. He fled across the English Channel, seeking exile in France. The Hellfire Club was suddenly, brutally, exposed. Its name and its rumored activities were now tied to a national scandal, screamed from the headlines and debated in every coffeehouse in London. The secrecy that had been its shield was shattered. The private joke had become a public crime, and the laughter in the Abbey was replaced by a deadly silence. The great betrayal in the House of Lords was a mortal wound. The scandal surrounding John Wilkes and the Essay on Woman dragged the Hellfire Club from the shadows and into the harsh, unforgiving glare of public scrutiny. The delicate ecosystem of secrecy, which had protected the monks for so long, was irrevocably contaminated. The theatrical game was over. The brethren, once bound by shared sin, now scattered like ghosts at dawn. The club, as a functioning entity, was finished. But the story of the Hellfire Club was just beginning. For as the historical society dissolved, its legend began to coalesce. The whispers that had once been confined to London's elite circles now became a roar that would echo through the centuries. The club's true legacy was not in what it did, but in what people believed it did. It was a legacy of whispers. Sir Francis Dashwood, the club's founder and abbot, the grand impresario of the entire affair, saw his public career effectively ended by the scandal. While he was never formally implicated, the association with Wilkes and the unveiled debaucheries was too great a stain. He retreated from the political stage, living out his remaining years as a country gentleman at his beloved West Wickham. He dedicated himself to his gardens, to his art collection, and to the life of a retired connoisseur. The pagan priest whose temple had been violated by public opinion now settled for a quieter existence. He died in 1781, leaving behind a legacy of architectural eccentricity and a reputation for being one of the great, if flawed, showmen of his age. The great betrayer, the Earl of Sandwich, weathered the political storm. His cynical maneuver had achieved its short-term goal of discrediting Wilkes, and he continued to hold high office for years to come. But his reputation was forever tarnished. His act of hypocrisy was so blatant that it earned him a permanent, unflattering nickname. He became widely known as Jemmy Twitcher, after a treacherous character in John Gay's popular satire, The Beggar's Opera, who betrays his friend, the highwayman Macheath. The name stuck. He would be remembered not as a great statesman, but as a symbol of aristocratic cynicism and disloyalty. John Wilkes, the man they had sought to destroy, emerged as the ultimate victor. His persecution by a corrupt government transformed him from a radical journalist into a national symbol of liberty. The public rallied around him. After several years in exile, he returned to England to a hero's welcome. He was elected to Parliament again, and despite initial resistance, was finally allowed to take his seat. He would go on to become the Lord Mayor of London, a triumphant and powerful figure whose career was built on the very scandal that was meant to ruin him. In the end, the attempt to expose his private vices only magnified his public virtues in the eyes of the people. And what of the other monks? Paul Whitehead, the club's loyal steward and poet, lived out his days quietly. When he died in 1774, his will contained one final Gothic flourish, a last piece of Hellfire theatre. He bequeathed his heart, along with the handsome sum of £50, to his patron and friend, Sir Francis Dashwood. Following his wishes, the heart was embalmed, placed within a marble urn, and deposited with great ceremony in the grand mausoleum that Dashwood had built at West Wickham. The ceremony was reportedly attended by a procession of local militia. For years, the urn containing Whitehead's heart was a morbid centerpiece of the mausoleum, a strange and tangible relic of the club's glory days. The story goes that it was eventually stolen in 1829 by an Australian visitor, a final, ignominious disappearance for the literal heart of the Hellfire Club. As the real members faded into history, their fictional counterparts took on a vibrant life of their own. The reality of the club's sophisticated, if debauched, playground for blasphemous satire was almost immediately consumed by a much darker and more exciting legend. The name Hellfire Club, which the members themselves had rarely used, became its permanent, infamous title. The rumor mill, fed by the scandal, transformed the club's activities. The parodies of Catholic rites were reimagined as genuine black masses. The toasts to pagan gods became pacts with the devil. The prostitutes dressed as nuns became unwilling virgins sacrificed on profane altars. The club became a catch-all for every fear society harbored about a godless, immoral aristocracy. This sensationalized version of the story became a staple of popular culture. It fueled the emerging genre of the Gothic novel, with its tales of decadent aristocrats, ruined abbeys, and diabolical secrets. In the 19th and 20th centuries, the legend was eagerly adopted by conspiracy theorists, who saw the club not as a historical anomaly, but as one manifestation of a continuous, hidden elite that secretly controlled the world. The Hellfire Club ceased to be a specific historical entity and became a powerful archetype. It became the blueprint for our modern conception of a decadent, satanic cult. Its influence in this mythologized form is vast. From the secret societies in the novels of Dennis Wheatley to the Gothic aesthetic of heavy metal bands, from the villains in superhero comics to the real-life moral panics about Satanism in the 1980s, the ghost of the Hellfire Club is there, a legacy of whispers that has proven to be far more enduring than the club itself. The historical truth was buried under a mountain of myth, and what remained was a story, a dark and seductive legend that spoke to a perennial fascination with what the rich and powerful might be doing when they believe no one is watching. And so we are left with the ghost of the Hellfire Club, a story that has become a tangled thicket of history, rumor, scandal, and myth. After peeling back the layers of legend, after sifting through the whispers and the political propaganda, we return to our central question. What was the Hellfire Club in the end? What was its true nature? Was it a cult of genuine sin, a performance of elaborate satire, or something else entirely? The truth, like the men who were its members, is complex, contradictory, and resists any simple definition. The club was a hall of mirrors, reflecting different truths depending on the angle from which it was viewed. Was it a genuine satanic cult, a coven of devil worshippers? Based on all credible evidence, the answer is a firm no. The popular image of the club, an image of black masses and demonic pacts, is a product of later fiction and scandalmongering. Sir Francis Dashwood and his brethren were not Satanists. They were, if anything, anti-Satanists. They had no interest in the Christian devil because they had no real interest in Christian theology, other than as a target for their mockery. To worship Satan is to accept the basic framework of Christian cosmology. It is to define oneself in opposition to the Christian God. The monks of Medmenham were doing something more radical. They were attempting to step outside that framework entirely. Theirs was a rejection of the whole Christian narrative in favor of a revived, albeit highly romanticized, classical paganism. They toasted Bacchus and Venus, not Beelzebub. Their sin was not a diabolical inversion of faith, but a hedonistic and intellectual dismissal of it. Was it, then, simply an elaborate adolescent joke? A playground for bored, wealthy men? To a very large extent, yes. At its heart, the Hellfire Club was a form of highly exclusive, high-concept university humor, performed with an aristocratic budget and a national stage. It was a club for men who had read the classics, who understood the liturgy of the church, and who possessed the wit and intelligence to parody them with precision. It was an expression of a particular kind of 18th century intellectual arrogance. The mock rituals, the bawdy hymns, the obscene poetry, it was all an elaborate inside joke, designed to amuse themselves and to affirm their own enlightened superiority over the pious, superstitious masses. It was a safe space for the powerful to indulge in the kind of rebellious, anti-establishment humor that would have been dangerous for any ordinary person. But to dismiss it as just a joke is to ignore its more serious dimensions. Was it a political conspiracy? While its primary purpose may not have been the overthrow of the state, it was undeniably a nexus of political power. Its members included prime ministers, cabinet members, and influential members of parliament. The club functioned as an informal and deeply private space where the political elite could forge alliances, share information, and test loyalties, far from the public scrutiny of parliament or the coffee houses. The shared bond of secrecy and transgression created a level of trust and a potential for blackmail that was a potent political tool. The downfall of the club, after all, was not a moral crusade. It was a purely political assassination, where the secrets of the club were used as a weapon in a struggle for power. In this sense, the line between private pleasure and public power was dangerously, and perhaps deliberately, blurred. Perhaps, in the end, the Hellfire Club was something more fundamental. It was a laboratory for exploring the duality of human nature. The 18th century, the age of reason, placed an immense pressure on the public man to be rational, virtuous, and controlled. The Hellfire Club was the reaction to that pressure. It was a space designed for the other self, the shadow self, to be unleashed. It was a testament to the enduring human need to create a separate world, a sacred or profane space, where the rules of normal life are suspended, a place where one can do what thou wilt. In this, it belongs to a long tradition of carnivals, masquerades, and secret societies, all of which provide a temporary release from the constraints of identity and social obligation. The story of the Hellfire Club is ultimately a story about hypocrisy. The hypocrisy of the members themselves, who preached liberty in public while practicing license in private. And the hypocrisy of the society that condemned them, a society whose public figures feigned outrage at the very vices many of them secretly practiced. It serves as a potent and enduring reminder that what powerful people do behind closed doors has always been a subject of both fascination and fear. The club's physical reality may have crumbled to dust, but its legend endures as a powerful whisper from the past. A whisper that questions the polished surfaces of history and asks us to consider what might lie hidden in the shadows, deep beneath the churches, and in the private rooms where the masks come off. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the decadent and secretive world of the Hellfire Club. The story is a potent reminder that the powerful are not always as respectable as they appear, and that history is often written in the space between public record and private rumor. What do you think was the true purpose of the Hellfire Club? A political network, a satirical project, or something else? Let us know your theories in the comments below. If you enjoy these explorations into the shadowy corners of the past, please consider liking this video and subscribing to Driftwood Histories for more tales found adrift in time. We are grateful for your support. Until next time, stay curious.